How can someone so gentle completely dismantle someone else's ego without even trying? Super empaths have a unique ability that most people don't recognize. They can see straight through emotional masks, detect authentic feelings beneath defensive behaviors, and respond to people's true essence rather than their performance. For most people, this creates deeper connection and understanding. But for avoidants, this ability is absolutely devastating. Avoidants build their entire identity around emotional control, mysterious depth, and being impossible to read or understand. Their ego depends on being the complex one, the independent one, the one who doesn't need anyone to see through them or figure them out. When a super empath enters their world, all of that crumbles. Not through confrontation or analysis, but through something much more powerful, authentic recognition. Here's how super empaths silently destroy avoidant egos through behaviors so natural they don't even realize they're doing it. Here's the first way super empaths demolish avoidant confidence. They see right through the avoidant's carefully constructed mask without even trying. While everyone else is impressed by the avoidant's mysterious depth and emotional sophistication, the super empath sees the scared, wounded person underneath all the performance. This isn't something they do consciously. Super empaths don't analyze or try to decode avoidant behavior. They simply see past surface presentations automatically because their entire emotional system is tuned to recognize authentic feeling rather than performed emotion. Avoidants spend enormous energy crafting personas that make them appear confident, independent, and emotionally superior. They've learned to hide vulnerability behind intellectual sophistication, fear behind emotional detachment, and neediness behind claims of self-sufficiency. But super empaths don't see the persona, they see the person. When an avoidant performs emotional strength, the empath sees emotional exhaustion. When an avoidant displays intellectual superiority, the empath senses the insecurity driving the performance. When an avoidant claims independence, the empath feels the loneliness underneath. This automatic recognition is devastating to avoidant ego because it eliminates their primary source of power, being misunderstood or mysterious. Their entire identity depends on people buying into their presentation, being impressed by their depth, or being confused by their complexity. When someone sees through all of that effortlessly and responds to their real self instead of their performed self, it exposes the gap between who they pretend to be and who they actually are. This exposure happens silently, without words, but the avoidant feels it immediately. They realize their mask isn't working, their performance isn't impressive, their emotional sophistication isn't fooling anyone. The super empath is seeing the real them, and somehow that feels more terrifying than being rejected. Now here's where it gets really interesting. Super empaths don't respond to avoidant performances or strategies. Instead, they respond to the pain driving those behaviors, which completely undermines the avoidant's entire approach to relationships. Avoidants have learned to get attention, validation, and control through emotional unavailability, mysterious behavior, and creating anxiety in others. They expect people to chase them, try to figure them out, or work hard to earn their emotional availability, but super empaths don't play that game. When an avoidant pulls back emotionally, the empath doesn't chase. They sense the fear driving the withdrawal and give space accordingly. When an avoidant acts mysterious or complicated, the empath doesn't try to solve them. They recognize the protection mechanism and respond with patience. When an avoidant creates distance, most people interpret it as rejection or disinterest and either pursue harder or give up entirely. But super empaths see through the distance to the underlying need for safety and respond to that need rather than the distancing behavior. This response completely disrupts avoidant strategy. They're not getting the chase they expected. They're not creating the anxiety they're used to generating. They're not receiving the validation that comes from having someone work hard to earn their attention. Instead, they're being seen and responded to based on their emotional truth rather than their emotional presentation. The empath is giving them what they actually need rather than what they're performing to receive. This leaves the avoidant feeling confused and somehow diminished. Their usual relationship dynamics aren't working. Their emotional strategies aren't creating the expected responses. They're being treated with kindness and understanding they didn't earn through their performance, which somehow feels worse than being misunderstood. But there's something even more ego-destroying happening here. Super empaths don't chase avoidance or try to validate their ego, which eliminates the avoidance sense of being special or superior. Avoidants are used to being the prize that others pursue. They're accustomed to people working hard to earn their attention, approval, or emotional availability. Their ego feeds on being the one who's harder to get, more independent, less needy than the people who want them. But super empaths don't need to possess or capture anyone. They don't chase people who are emotionally unavailable because they're not trying to fill an internal void through external validation. They're complete within themselves and only engage with people who are genuinely available for mutual connection. This means they don't get caught up in the push-pull dynamic that avoidants create. They don't interpret avoidant withdrawal as a challenge to overcome or a puzzle to solve. They simply recognize emotional unavailability for what it is and respond accordingly by not pursuing it. The avoidant finds themselves in the unfamiliar position of not being chased, not being seen as a prize to be won, not being treated as someone whose attention is particularly valuable or hard to earn. The super empath treats them like any other person, with kindness and respect, but without the special treatment their ego has learned to expect. This deflation happens silently but powerfully. The avoidant realizes they're not generating the usual reactions. They're not being put on a pedestal. They're not being seen as mysteriously complex or fascinatingly difficult. They're just being seen as human. For someone whose entire sense of superiority depends on being harder to understand and connect with than other people, being treated as equally accessible and normal feels like a profound ego wound. And then comes something that really throws them off balance. Super empaths mirror emotional unavailability back without any emotional charge or manipulation behind it. When an avoidant is distant, the super empath is naturally distant in return, not out of hurt or retaliation, but out of respect for the avoidant's obvious need for space. When an avoidant is emotionally unavailable, the empath matches that energy level without trying to force more connection than the avoidant is offering. This mirroring behavior is completely different from the usual responses avoidants receive. Most people either chase when an avoidant withdraws, or they withdraw with hurt and resentment. Both responses give the avoidant a sense of impact and power. They're either being pursued despite their unavailability, or they're causing emotional distress through their distance. But super empaths don't chase, and they don't get hurt by emotional unavailability. They simply match the energy they're receiving and continue focusing on their own emotional well-being. When someone is distant, they're distant too. When someone is unavailable, they become unavailable as well. This creates a mirror effect that shows avoidants exactly what they're offering others. Instead of having someone pursue them despite their emotional distance, they're getting the same distance reflected back to them. Instead of feeling powerful for being unavailable, they start feeling the loneliness of their own emotional isolation. The avoidant suddenly finds themselves experiencing what it's like to be on the receiving end of their own behavior. They're getting exactly what they're giving, and somehow it doesn't feel as good as they expected it would. This mirroring happens naturally from the empath side. They're not trying to teach lessons or create consequences. They're simply responding authentically to the energy they're receiving. But for the avoidant, it creates an uncomfortable self-awareness about their own emotional patterns. But here's what's even more devastating to avoidant ego. Super empaths are genuinely unbothered by hot and cold behavior because they don't take it personally. Avoidants use inconsistent behavior as a way to maintain control and test people's emotional stability. They'll be warm and engaging one day, distant and unavailable the next, expecting people to either chase during the cold periods or become emotional about the inconsistency. But super empaths don't get activated by inconsistent behavior because they understand it's not about them. When someone is warm, they respond warmly. When someone is distant, they give space. They don't try to create consistency in others or take responsibility for managing other people's emotional states. This unbothered response is deeply frustrating for avoidants because it eliminates their ability to create emotional chaos or maintain power through unpredictability. They're used to their hot and cold behavior having impact, making people anxious, confused, or desperate for the warm periods to return. But super empaths just roll with whatever energy is being offered without trying to control or change it. They're not anxiously waiting for the avoidant to be warm again. They're not confused by the distance. They're not trying to figure out what they did wrong during the shift from hot to cold. This lack of emotional reaction reveals to the avoidant that their behavior patterns aren't actually that powerful or impactful. Their emotional inconsistency isn't creating the drama or attention they're used to generating. They're not successfully keeping someone emotionally off balance or invested in managing their moods. The avoidant starts to realize that their hot and cold behavior is just being accepted as their natural way of being rather than seen as complex emotional depth or fascinating unpredictability. This acceptance somehow feels more diminishing than being misunderstood. Then comes perhaps the most ego-destroying recognition of all. Super empaths see the wounded child beneath the avoidant's sophisticated adult persona, and they respond to that child with compassion rather than being impressed by the adult performance. Avoidants have spent years developing complex adult personas that hide their core wounds and vulnerabilities. They've learned to appear emotionally sophisticated, intellectually superior, and psychologically advanced as a way to avoid being seen as the hurt, scared person they feel like inside. But super empaths don't see the sophisticated persona. They see the wounded child underneath it. They recognize the fear driving the emotional sophistication, the pain behind the intellectual superiority, the vulnerability beneath the psychological complexity. This recognition is devastating because it cuts through all the avoidance emotional development and sees them as they truly are. Someone who learned very early that being vulnerable was dangerous and has spent their life developing elaborate ways to avoid that vulnerability. The super empath doesn't judge this wounded child or try to fix it, but they also don't pretend not to see it. They respond with natural compassion and understanding, which somehow feels more exposing than being criticized or rejected. The avoidant realizes that all their sophisticated emotional defenses are transparent to this person. All their carefully constructed complexity is being seen as simple self-protection. All their adult emotional superiority is being recognized as childhood coping mechanisms. This recognition strips away the avoidant's sense of being emotionally evolved or psychologically advanced. They're being seen as someone who's still operating from old wounds, rather than someone who's transcended their past through emotional sophistication. But there's another element that quietly undermines avoidant superiority. Super empaths thrive independently without needing validation from emotionally unavailable people. Avoidants are used to being sought after by people who are looking for external validation, trying to fill internal voids, or hoping to fix their own attachment issues through relationships with emotionally challenging people. This gives avoidants a sense of being valuable and necessary, but super empaths are already whole. They don't need anyone else to complete them, validate them, or provide them with a sense of worth. They engage in relationships from a place of abundance rather than neediness, which means they're naturally attracted to mutual availability rather than emotional challenges. This independence is threatening to avoidant ego because it eliminates their sense of being needed or valuable. They're not filling any void in the empath's life. They're not providing anything essential that the empath can't provide for themselves. They're not being seen as a prize worth working hard to obtain. The super empath's natural self-sufficiency reveals that the avoidant's emotional unavailability isn't actually that valuable or attractive. Their independence isn't impressive to someone who's already independent. Their self-sufficiency isn't appealing to someone who's already self-sufficient. This creates an uncomfortable realization for the avoidant that their entire sense of superiority is based on being more independent than people who aren't actually independent. When they encounter someone who's genuinely self-sufficient, their relative independence suddenly doesn't feel special anymore. They're forced to confront the possibility that their emotional unavailability isn't a sign of superior development. It's just emotional unavailability. Their independence isn't proof of greater strength. It's just a defense mechanism that looks less impressive next to genuine self-sufficiency. And finally, the most powerful ego destroyer of all, Super empaths offer unconditional love while maintaining perfect boundaries, which eliminates the avoidant sense of being specially complex or difficult to love. Avoidants are used to being in relationships where people either try to change them or accept their emotional limitations while sacrificing their own needs. Both dynamics feed avoidant ego. Either they're seen as a challenge worth taking on, or they're seen as someone whose needs matter more than their partner's needs. But super empaths love people exactly as they are, while never compromising their own well-being or boundaries. They don't try to change avoidance, but they also don't enable avoidant behavior that doesn't serve mutual connection. This combination is devastating to avoidant ego because it eliminates both their sense of being a special challenge and their sense of being more important than their partner's needs. The empath's love doesn't come with an agenda to change them, but it also doesn't come with a willingness to accept less than mutual respect and availability. The avoidant finds themselves being loved unconditionally while simultaneously being held to healthy relationship standards. They're not being asked to be different, but they're also not being enabled to be less than their best self. This dynamic reveals to the avoidant that healthy love doesn't require them to be perfect, but it also doesn't require their partner to accept emotional scraps. They're being shown what mutual, healthy love actually looks like, and it's nothing like the power dynamics they're used to creating. The super empath's ability to love fully while maintaining boundaries shows the avoidant that their emotional unavailability isn't a necessary part of love. It's just emotional unavailability. Their complexity isn't required for deep connection. It's just an obstacle to it. When super empaths encounter avoidance, they create a unique dynamic that silently dismantles everything the avoidant's ego depends on. Without trying to change, fix, or challenge the avoidant, they simply respond authentically to what they see and feel. This authentic response reveals the avoidant's masks, deflates their sense of superiority, mirrors their unavailability back to them, and shows them what genuine emotional availability actually looks like. The result is an ego that slowly crumbles under the weight of being truly seen and authentically loved. The most powerful part of this dynamic is that it happens entirely without words, confrontation, or intention to harm. The super empath is simply being themselves, but their authentic way of being exposes everything false about the avoidant's carefully constructed identity. Have you noticed these signs when a super empath enters an avoidant's life? Drop a comment about which sign feels most familiar from your observations. If this helped you understand the unique dynamic between empaths and avoidance, like this video and subscribe for more insights about attachment patterns and relationship dynamics. Thanks for watching.